so we've got the idea of short-run aggregate supply. So what we can now do is show how does that process that we've mapped out as a chain of reasoning, how does that play out diagrammatically. So we're going to use ADAS, but we're going to use short-run aggregate supply this time, to show how the neoclassical economists believe that the economy can self-stabilize. So as usual, we're going to have real GDP down here. We're going to have the price level up here. What we're going to do here is we're going to say this is the level of output at which unemployment is at the NARU. So over here, so over here GDP is high. So we have, remember, low unemployment up there. Down here GDP is low. So we have high unemployment over here. Obviously that's zero GDP technically. So you'd have 100% unemployment. Over here somewhere we've got completely full employment. So we've said our short-run aggregate supply slopes upwards for reasons that we outlined earlier. It's based on costs. Let's suppose that initially the economy is in equilibrium at point A. So unemployment's at the NARU. The power of firms and workers is balanced. And then let's suppose there is some sort of a shock. So what happens is there is some shock that reduces aggregate demand to AD2, real GDP falls, and the economy is temporarily in equilibrium at point B. And the question is, what happens next? So in the neoclassical world, what they're saying is that product and labour markets are fully flexible, and there is therefore going to be a process where, because unemployment is now above the NARU, unemployment is worse than the NARU, GDP is low, unemployment's high, what's going to start happening is that we said that the decrease in aggregate demand that takes us to point B, that's going to lead to a decrease in wages, and that in turn is going to lead to a decrease in costs. And as costs fall, we said that's going to lead to a shift in short-run aggregate supply. So as a result of the reduction in wages, short-run aggregate supply falls. As a result, short-run aggregate supply increases, it becomes to a more favourable position, it shifts down vertically. The price level is driven down, and that leads to an extension in aggregate demand. AD starts to rise, for the reasons that we outlined earlier. But unemployment is still worse than the NARU, unemployment is still above the NARU, therefore wages continue to fall. Short-run aggregate supply adjusts again. The price level comes down to PL4, GDP rises to Y4, but still unemployment's above the NARU, and this process therefore continues until there is no further downward pressure on wages. We arrive at equilibrium at point E. So in the long run, all that's happened is that initially the economy started at A. Temporarily, we were away from the NARU. Unemployment rose, GDP fell, and we were in short-run equilibrium at B. Then the process of self-stabilization occurred. This whole process here was driven by a decrease in costs. Gradually, the economy recovered, and we returned back to equilibrium, back to the NARU at point E. So we haven't literally gone back to the original point A. We've self-stabilized to this level of GDP, the GDP at which the economy's at the NARU. And as a result, in the long run, all that's happened is we've moved from A to E. So in the long run, neoclassical economists say aggregate supply is vertical. And all that's saying is that we eventually return to the NARU, but just with a different price level. You can see the same process if there's a sudden increase in aggregate demand. Again, the economy is going to self-stabilize. Suppose aggregate demand rises as a result of, say, a sudden increase in consumer confidence. Temporarily, unemployment falls below the NARU. GDP rises to Y2. The economy's in short-run equilibrium at point B. But now unemployment's really low, so what's going to happen is that real wages are going to start getting pushed up. As wages increase, that increases costs, which shifts the short-run aggregate supply vertically, and that starts to lead to a contraction in AD, a reduction in AD along the function, because it's caused by the price level. As prices rise to PL3, AD falls, and GDP falls to Y3. Unemployment's still above the NARU, unemployment's still below the NARU, GDP is high, Workers have lots of power, therefore again wages rise, and the short run aggregate supply shift again to SRAS 3. Again, the price level increases, to PL whatever, because of the rise in the price level, there's a reduction in real purchasing power of savings. Exports become less competitive. AD falls again, and again, this process is going to continue until the power of firms and workers is balanced. Until eventually we've returned back to the NERU, but all we've ended up with is a higher price level. So again, your long-run aggregate supply function is vertical. Now, obviously, long-run aggregate supply can change. It can shift as a result of improvements in the supply side. I mean, in terms of the way you've seen things so far, we've drawn aggregate supply like that. The same factors that can cause the Keynesian aggregate supply scheduled shift like that are the factors that can cause the neoclassical long-run aggregate supply schedule to change like that. And because Keynesians don't really believe in this self-stabilisation process, the Keynesian aggregate supply function that we've drawn up to this point, you can now call long-run aggregate supply, because they're saying if aggregate demand falls in the Keynesian world, then actually we're going to get stuck, even in the long run, we're going to get stuck at a lower level of GDP. Whereas the neoclassical one, they're saying if aggregate demand was to fall, then although temporarily GDP might fall below the level of the NERU, in the long run the economy will adjust. So whilst in the short run we go from A to B, in the long run the economy returns to the NERU, but just with a different price level. And that's the fundamental difference. What we need to be able to do, though, is to explain, therefore, I mean, a lot of people can do the diagram, but the stuff that we did earlier on the process and why this is true, this is the important thing, to be able to understand that process and explain how it is that an economy recovers from a shock, according to neoclassical economists and assuming that labour and product markets are fully flexible.